When it comes to COVID-19 compared to the Spanish flu, there's been a lot of talk about the similarities and the differences in these two pandemics. But if you ask any historian, they're likely to tell you that history often repeats itself, sometimes with just some slight variations. That seems to be the case in our current situation. Our next guest took a fascinating look at North Carolina's responses to the two different pandemics. And she joins me now. Brenée Goforth is the John Locke Foundation's social media manager. She also is a writer for CarolinaJournal.com. Brenée, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
This is such a fun piece, and people can read this at CarolinaJournal.com. So I say that fun in quotes because obviously the subject isn't fun, pandemics, but it's really interesting what you did. Before we get started and talk about the similarities, why did you get interested in even looking at this?
Absolutely. So there was a lot of people talking about the similarities and the differences and how pandemics come every 100 years, all of that kind of thing. And so it piqued my interest, and I thought, well, what about North Carolina? I mean, every state, particularly back then, would have been a little bit different in the way that it handled, these kinds of situations. And I started a deep dive into historical newspaper articles, reading all about it. And there was just so much there that I had to write something.
And in fact, some of those images from those long ago newspaper pages are actually part of this story. And that's why it's so important. Go ahead and read this piece at CarolinaJournal.com. The headline, Comparing North Carolina's Responses to Spanish Flu and COVID-19. All right, masks. We know right now we're under a statewide mandate from Governor Roy Cooper about masks. Tell us what you found when you looked back 100 years.
Yes. So masks back in the day were recommended, but they weren't recommended the way that they are now. So we're about 60 days into Roy Cooper's 30-day mask mandate from June. And every person in North Carolina is required to wear these masks when they go out and about, healthy, sick, what have you. That wasn't the case back during the Spanish flu. The recommendation was really only for people who were taking care of the sick, doctors, nurses, or people who had somebody who had the Spanish flu in their home and were taking care of them to wear the masks. They weren't meant for just going out and about and all of those kinds of things. And they were usually made at home, and they were made from gauze or butter cloth, which would be called butter muslin now. It's similar to cheesecloth, and they would be 4 layers, as opposed to kind of the guidance that we saw at the beginning of don't wear a mask for the general population. And then once we got orders to wear a mask, it was, it could be anything. It could be made out of an old T-shirt, things like that. We didn't have this similar guidance for 4 layers of this particular material or anything like that. It was kind of a free-for-all, and it caused a little bit of confusion, as we can see.
Interesting that 100 years ago, they're not going to be ordering masks online or trying to get the most stylish mask, but people were making them at home. And you said 4 layers. That's interesting to me. Do we know at all if that is related to any science or medical recommendation, or were they just kind of using common sense and thinking, okay, the thicker I make this thing, maybe the less likely I am to get infected?
Yeah, so we don't have any information necessarily. This did come from, the health organizations of the time. This was their recommendation. And so we don't have any information about how they came to that conclusion, but I'm assuming that it was a mixture of as much protection as you can get and still be able to breathe.
Exactly. So these days, we have been reading stories about in different cities, you will have people who are essentially snitching on others for not wearing a mask. And there's been a lot of shaming, particularly with social media these days. I mean, it's kind of gone rampant. Was there shaming or telling on people 100 years ago?
Yes. So North Carolina didn't have, like I said, a statewide mandate. Other states and other cities did. So San Francisco and California is one of those examples of places where they had mandates. And there was, snitching and all of those kinds of things. But in North Carolina in particular, there were pieces that would show up in the newspaper that would criticize people who said that they didn't want to wear a mask or anything like that. You've got the piece right there, and it's on CarolinaJournal.com if you want to go check it out. But it's very interesting. They compared somebody not wearing a mask to somebody who wears fancy socks or silly ties or anything like that.
That sounds so similar to some of the arguments today.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're ridiculous for not wearing your mask and all that. So I guess people are people, whether they were living in the early 1900s or in 2020. So that's pretty fascinating. quarantines. Were people put away so that they would not infect other people?
Yeah, so we have kind of a quarantine that we all did where everybody was recommended to stay at home, all of those kinds of things kind of statewide. So quarantines typically weren't actually given out to an entire state or an entire city unless it showed evidence of a particular outbreak. So quarantines typically were kept for people who were actually sick. If you were found sick, you would be quarantined in your home, and there would actually be quarantine officers who came and made sure that you were staying at home and all of those kinds of things, enforced these. And if you broke a quarantine, you could be threatened with now what in today's money would be up to $1,000 fine.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, or 10 to 30 days in jail, which would start after you got better. They wouldn't just throw you in jail while you were still sick. But on top of that, there was an instance in Rockingham in North Carolina where they shut down the whole city after they got, quite a few cases there. They had police officers stationed outside of the city making sure nobody came in and out. They put, placards on, barbershop doors, all of these kinds of things. It was very different from what we're seeing now, but it was, interestingly enough, pretty strictly enforced.
It sounds like during the Spanish flu that you had local officials who were making their decisions for their particular area versus what we're seeing right now from Governor Roy Cooper is in large part a one-size-fits-all mandate for everything. And local officials can do something if they want it to be stricter than what the governor has outlined. But is that difference really that stark, that it was local people back then?
It really does seem pretty hyper-local, the reactions that all of these places are getting. And you can see that when you go back and look at these historical newspapers, because there were so many. We have kind of a consolidation of newspapers now, but there were so many, 100 years ago when this was the only way for people to get their information. And, the amount that they were enforcing in certain areas would be different than they were enforcing in other cities. So you'd get some really stern enforcement, you'd get some really lax enforcement, and actually the quarantine officers had quite a bit of responsibility on their shoulders because you could be fired or given a misdemeanor if you weren't doing your job, which happened a couple of times in North Carolina to those quarantine officers.
Now, in today's situation, we have not only Governor Roy Cooper, but Dr. Mandy Cohen, who's the Secretary of Health and Human Services, making the decisions. And we now all know about the 3 W's, the wait, wash, and wear during COVID-19. Did we have 3 W's or something like it 100 years ago?
No, the health advice that was going out then was similarly, pretty basic, right? So they would tell you to, wash your hands, stay away from crowds, all of those kinds of things.
So similar to today, but maybe just not branded
not
as
punchy.
The 3 W's. Exactly. They didn't have a Brenée Goforth working for them, right?
No, they didn't.
Exactly.
But on top of that, they had some interesting things that they would do. They had something called Dakin solution, which they recommended you sprayed in your throat. And, too much ingestion of that can be dangerous. So I would not recommend that one, but washing hands is still great advice.